I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Ohlone people and offer respect towards their elders and to all Ohlone people of past and present. Thank you so much to the Haas Institute and to the College of Environmental Design for the invitation and space to speak today. I would also like to recognize that there are members of our audience who are leaders in disability movements and who have lived some of the history that I'm going to talk about today. As an access note, I will be reading, speaking, and showing images which will be described. Today I'll be speaking about how norms of disability, race, and gender shape accessible design. Whereas most scholarship on accessibility seeks to convince the unconvinced of the value of inclusion, my work falls into a paradigm that I call critical access studies. The wordplay is intentional here. Access is critical both in the sense of its urgency and in the need for critique. Critical access studies holds accessibility's promises of inclusion in tension with what Donna Haraway calls non-innocence. That even while technologies and material forms may promise justice or equity, their entanglement with systems of discrimination and domination also demand different forms of accountability. Throughout my talk, I'll show how efforts to expand accessibility have often produced new and unacknowledged challenges for the project of disability justice. Rather than take access for granted as a de facto or common sense good, I'll investigate its epistemologies and political commitments through an analysis of what I call knowing making, that's with a hyphen. Not just designed things, but also the knowledges that enable them. And this is a feminist science studies framework that I'm applying to disability studies of the built environment. In my broader work, I explore critical access through ethnography, pedagogy, disability justice activism, and design experimentation. Today, I'm going to focus on historical modes of knowing making that shaped who counts as a disabled user and how designers could know. My primary concern is the question of how differences between the categories of disability, race, and gender materialize and how they come to matter. Most intersectional disability scholarship builds on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw to explore the mutual reinforcement of systems of ableism, racism, and sexism, or what Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination. And here I'm thinking about scholars like Chris Bell, Mel Chen, Sue Schweik, Melissa Thompson, and Leroy Moore, among others. My work adds an additional layer to this discussion by addressing how disability, race, and gender came to appear as non-entangled and non-intersecting single issues in designed environments. This is important because it reveals how common beliefs or discourses surrounding accessibility are actually working against intersectionality. And it also maps the structural and ideological systems in which various forms of access participate, helping scholars and designers to understand how the disabled user or inhabitant has come to appear as a presumed white, middle class, and cisgender heterosexual body. So I'll begin with some examples of what I mean by knowing making, and then I'll take us through how accessible design emerged in relation to the rehabilitation profession, how disability activists, like those here at Berkeley, challenged this in order to transform architectural education, and also how contemporary framings of disability through the disability justice movement provide a different way of thinking about the project of critical access. So let's look at some examples. First is method. There's a rumor that in the early days of Berkeley's disability movement, activists went out into the city under dark of night, smashing sidewalks with sledgehammers and using bags of cement to pour curb cuts. The photo on the right shows the cover of disability magazine, The Independent. There are 4 white disabled activists, 2 walking and 2 using wheelchairs. And the ones on the far right are Hale Zukas and Eric Dipner. And they're going up the first city-funded curb cut in Berkeley. These activists actually deny ever smashing sidewalks at night, but the stories about sidewalk smashing have become part of the mythos of disability culture, articulating a sensibility that when disabled people engage in direct action, we also design and make new material worlds. And on the left is actually a chunk of concrete from a demonstration in Denver by the direct action group ADAPT, and this is held in the collections of the Smithsonian Institution. The curb cut is often used to tell a story about accessibility as universally beneficial. That this feature developed for wheelchair users was also found to benefit mothers, people pushing strollers, bicyclists, people pushing shopping carts. And so a common conclusion is that curb cuts benefit everyone. Web designers have borrowed this as a metaphor, citing the curb cut effect to discuss the benefits of disability technologies for multiple users. This story also bears the textures of a kind of liberal disability rights narrative. Building curb cuts comes to mean paving over obstacles, creating easy transitions, similar to assumptions that when rights are legislated, oppressive barriers disappear. But the curb cut also tells another story, the story of the sledgehammer against sidewalk, of designing as protest, and even a story of friction. The raised bumps that appear on most curb cuts today were a designed response to the way that curb cuts in their smooth transition from sidewalk to street failed to notify blind people of the elevation change. After several iterations of materials and designs, activists invented tactile paving as a way of sharing space, but with friction. This sensibility regarding experimentation and cross-disability coalitions suggests a design politics of non-compliance and anti-assimilation. Second example, market. In suburban Ohio, a married couple, one disabled woman who uses a wheelchair and her non-disabled husband, both white, have constructed a 3,500 square foot luxury craftsman home as a universal design living laboratory, shown in this image with its beige stone exterior, covered drive-through, and expansive lawn. This is what colloquially we would call a McMansion. The space is meant to be a showroom for universal design products focused on aging and wheelchair users, such as zero-slope entrances, grab bars built into the hallways and bathrooms, and kitchens designed with countertops of two sizes, hers and his. But it's also a showroom for the idea that universal design ought to be invisible, refusing to announce the presence of disability, as if disability was a stigmatizing quality. This site communicates a notion that universal design means better consumer cultures for individual, aging, and disabled people, that it seamlessly integrates with heterosexual and wealthy nuclear family formations, and that the ultimate goal of access should be luxury home design, an idea that is complicated by the historical, racial, and economic underpinnings of suburban homeownership in the US. Third example, assemblage. According to Letty Madam Stacy Architects, the Ed Roberts campus at the Ashby BART station, just down the street from here, is a universally designed transit-oriented campus that expresses the idea that good design is fundamentally a social justice issue. The building features a street-level window that overlooks an interior ramp, a winding red spiral suspended from cables beneath a large circular skylight. In the interior photo shown here, taken by disabled photographer Anthony Tussler, who was part of the movement here in Berkeley, a photography exhibit is apparent against a long, rounded wall behind the ramp with photos of disability protest from the Paul Longmore Institute's exhibit, Patient No More. The exhibit commemorated the historic 504 sit-in, which led to a commitment to enforce federal accessibility law. Unlike the previous example, accessibility is not just marked here, but it's celebrated. And in addition to this kind of like festive red ramp, the building's wayfinding signage, textured concrete, automatic sensors and doors, restrooms, natural light, open spaces, and raised bed rooftop garden assemble to materialize the legacy of Bay Area disability rights organizations, which are housed inside. And the building is not just a building, it's a node in a broader assemblage. Nearly as old as Berkeley's disability communities, BART was the first US public transportation system built in the midst of a shifting federal disability rights landscape between the late 60s and early 70s. The same year that Berkeley adopted its mandate for city-funded curb cuts, 1973, the Ashby station opened to the public, its construction having been delayed by disability activists' friction demands for elevator access. Together, the curb cuts and BART's transit system are often attributed to the rise of the area's large disabled population and the independent living movement's success. There's also another history surrounding this site. a story of race, land, and power. In the 60s, as part of urban renewal efforts that displaced many poor and elderly African Americans in Oakland and Berkeley, BART broke ground on the Ashby station by using eminent domain to clear a rail corridor. Many homes and businesses were displaced. Justified in the name of solving pathologized urban poverty, these events were built into a regime of productive, white, spatial citizenship, which buttressed legal efforts toward accessibility and simultaneously intensified the surveillance and displacement of urban communities of color. In the years since the Ed Roberts campus was built, development proposals have intensified, leading nearby residents to express concerns about gentrification and displacement. With new amenities many fear will come higher rent prices in a metropolitan area already experiencing an affordable housing crisis, evictions, and one of the country's largest populations of unsheltered, unhoused people, many of whom are disabled. But these are not issues that are typically considered as part of accessible design. According to a recent report by the Haas Institute, the area surrounding the Ashby station has moderate to high levels of racial segregation even today. So each of these examples that I've just shown illustrates at least some elements of universal design, a late 20th century philosophy aimed at creating design for all. We get the sense that accessibility can apply across different scales of design, products, buildings, technologies, cities. But each space also embodies a very different way of understanding the category of disability, whether as a medical, political, or consumer category. In each space, the promises of design for all actually materialize in relation to a very particular type of disabled user. And whether you or I or anyone else are part of that all depends on whether our presence has been anticipated. In other words, making is entangled with and produces ways of knowing. Accessible design, sometimes called barrier-free design in the US, became part of legal codes beginning in the late 60s. Then in the 80s, a discourse of universal design emerged through the work of disabled architect Ronald Mace, who sought a way to go beyond legal codes to expand the category of the user and also to establish a consumer market for accessible products. Here I'm showing the 1997 Principles of Universal Design poster. It's in neon pink and chartreuse, and the principles are listed here. They are equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. These borrow terms of art from fields such as human-computer interaction and rehabilitation. And they're translated into at least 11 languages, appear as mandates in the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons, and have also influenced accessibility in fields far beyond architecture and product design, including feminist theory, education, information science, public health, web accessibility, writing and composition, and more recently, urban planning, which is where my current book project is. So the stakes of a more critical understanding of accessibility and universal design are actually quite high because of the reach of these concepts into so many fields and also into so many geographic areas. To understand why the accessibility movement emerged, we can look to the history of the architectural user. Historians such as Barbara Penner, Lance Hosey, and Rob Emery have shown that architects' conceptions of the user are linked to an apparently white, able-bodied, and often masculine body that came to appear as neutral through its citation in handbooks such as the Architectural Graphic Standards. Here I'm showing two images. On the left is Charles Davenport, who is a eugenicist. He was hired by the military to measure soldiers' bodies for anthropometric studies. So in the images, there's just like a series of Davenport measuring this one soldier's body. And this created a database of embodied statistics that were then exported into civilian use. On the right is ergonomist Alvin Tilley, who used Davenport's data for this figure called Average Joe, who's this kind of like outline of a masculine body on the wall behind him. And he also used data from home economics for another figure called Average Josephine, who's next to him. So there's kind of like a man and a woman. And these were reproduced in the industrial design firm Henry Dreyfuss Associates book, The Measure of Man, and later in the graphic standards. So we can see that the figure of the user is a statistical fiction taken from particular bodies, here strong soldiers and homemakers, and applied to a broader range of designs. In the second photo, Joe and Josephine contrast with Tilly himself, who's an enfleshed person who doesn't resemble either one of them. He's quite a bit shorter. So I call this reliance on average data the Normate Template for design, drawing on Rosemary Garland Thompson's concept of the normate as an unmarked privileged body that comes to appear normal through its circulation and cultural reproduction. The Normate Template is one reason why built environments are not often created with disability in mind. In response to the Normate Template, a new regime emerged to study the disabled user. I call this access knowledge, again with a hyphen, recalling Michel Foucault's notion of power knowledge as a regime encompassing ways of knowing populations as well as managing and standardizing acceptable forms of life. Here I'm showing a page from the graphic standards from the early 80s, which shows Average Joe using a wheelchair and extending arms into space, along with indications of measurements. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's also Average Joe standing and using a white cane. These figures drew on data from the 60s and remain some of the only depictions of disability in the graphic standards today. The new disabled figures were based on research conducted in the 60s at a rehabilitation program for disabled students funded by the GI Bill at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. This research, which included measuring bodies in wheelchairs similar to those anthropometric measurements I showed earlier, led to ANSI A117.1, which was the first accessibility standard. And here I'm showing the cover of it. It says, American Standard Specifications for Making Buildings and Facilities Accessible to and Usable by the Physically Handicapped. So this was the first accessibility standard in the US, and it was then exported globally with the specific bodies of students in this program serving as standards for accessibility, even in places where, for example, wheelchairs were not the dominant assistive technology. So there are places where wheelchair accessible restrooms, for example, are constructed outside of the United States, but people actually use different kinds of mobilities, and those restrooms are not usable to them. The bodies researched for the standards were, one, the white disabled soldier, so resembling Joe in the wheelchair. On the left is an image from the University of Illinois that shows a scientist in a white coat standing next to this long ramp, and then there's also a wheelchair user who's one of the soldiers, veterans who's in the program, going up the ramp. So they measured the white disabled soldier body to create the standards. And then in the second image, the other figure was the white disabled suburban housewife. And she is shown here in this kind of demonstration accessible kitchen. And these are both images from research studies at the University of Illinois. And this is, I just want to point out that this is part of a larger post-war culture of eugenics and constructed normalcy, and with rehabilitation at its center. So the main justification for accessibility in these standards was its place in what David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder call an able nationalist project of rehabilitating disabled soldiers into productive spatial citizens. Access could return soldiers to work where they would become contributing consumers. Later, this was extended to people with polio-related disabilities, so it included both soldiers and civilians. Accessibility was not a disability justice project. It was a project based on normalization. And this is ironic because in the field of disability studies, we talk about accessible built environments as an alternative to medicalizing disabled bodies. And the idea is that we should focus on the environment and not the person's body. But it turns out that this idea actually came from the rehabilitation field as a way of saying that the environment can be used to optimize and make productive disabled bodies. And this idea carries through today in the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, which highlights employment and productivity as conditions of disabled citizenship. and actually draws on this exact data for some parts of the accessibility guidelines. So the history that I'm telling today is challenging some of the core assumptions of disability studies. In advertisements and advocacy documents from the late 50s going forward, accessibility proponents, all of whom, as far as I could tell, were white, male rehabilitation engineers, claimed that accessible design is designed for all. The term all was not dissimilar from contemporary mottos like All Lives Matter, which presume the neutrality of invoking a population while not attending to differences and inequalities within that population. For example, these accessibility standards emerged in the Jim Crow era, and most of the buildings and places upon which they focused, suburban homes, public schools, universities, churches, and public transportation, were highly racially segregated spaces. The word all was sometimes used as a reference to design for the lifespan or design for aging. But access to aging in these conditions was also extremely racialized. Epidemiologist Nancy Krieger has shown that in the Jim Crow era, Black people living in segregated spaces were 20% less likely to live to be 65 years old and hence aging. And this aligns with what public health scholars studying the social determinants of health tell us about how, for example, neighborhoods affect life expectancy. The accessibility standards also emerged during national conversations about race in the US, during the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act in the mid to late 60s, as well as racial uprisings in many cities. The GI Bill that funded disabled veterans attending universities was also used to fund mortgages that were exclusively available to white veterans, and is in many ways attributed to the successes of suburbanization and white flight, which then led to disinvestment in cities. Accessibility advocates rarely acknowledge struggles against racial segregation that framed their historical moment. So even though they were saying space should be desegregated for all people, they didn't actually talk about racial segregation. And when they did, they adopted what today we would characterize as a post-racial ideology, claiming that civil rights laws had passed and therefore solved the problem of US racism, and that the time had come for disability rights laws. So this was both an elision of ongoing racism and an investment in liberal rights regimes as solving oppression while also distinguishing the categories of disability and race. Advocates' persistent use of the term design for all was also qualified by notions of citizenship. At the same time that Congress was debating the results of the Kerner Commission report, which found that uprisings in cities were the result of white supremacy and white flight to the suburbs, and basically unequal citizenship, it heard proceedings from the Design for All Americans report, which claimed accessibility as a primary right of citizenship and linked accessible spaces to living the amenities of the good US suburban life. This framing of all Americans completely ignored that the citizenship status of Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latin Americans was, as it remains today, an unresolved question. Not just in terms of racial segregation, but also immigration restrictions, the criminalization of poverty, and later mass incarceration. So this recalls Michelle Alexander's argument that civil rights laws did not end Jim Crow, but merely redesigned the language that we use to describe it. The Design for All Americans report resulted in the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. And the framing of the report also revealed the unequally distributed benefits of able nationalism for disabled people. While upholding the physically disabled worker, soldier, and mother, institutionalized and intellectually disabled people were not considered valuable to the nation. And accessibility standards thus focused more on physical usability than on mental or sensory accessibility. And on top of all of that, laws addressing housing equity, voting rights, and other civil rights did not expand to include a focus on disability or gender until the 80s, effectively describing these all as separate categories. So we have an active construction of non-intersectionality. So the rehabilitation framework was not just problematic because of how it medicalized and normalized disabled bodies, but also in the way that it rendered race and gender as non-existent considerations in ableism. This highlights what philosopher Charles Mills terms the epistemology of ignorance. As Heidi Grasswick writes about this concept, ignorance is not the result of a benign gap in our knowledge, but but deliberate choices to pursue certain kinds of knowledge while ignoring others. The reliance of accessibility on rehabilitation models and data produced a regime of ignorance. Because the rehab model presented itself as scientific and data-driven, disabled bodies came to appear legible only through measurement, such as in those graphic standards images that I showed. And even then, only some disabled bodies. But ideological commitments to whiteness, compulsory rehabilitation, and heteronormativity were illegible. And then these epistemologies of ignorance were reproduced by resulting disability rights laws, as well as in some versions of the architecture profession's attempts to diversify education and practices. For example, in 1965, the American Institute of Architects worked with the Vocational Rehabilitation Administration and drew upon the draft of Design for All Americans to design a $60,000 professional education program on accessibility. The curriculum called for designing and building for the real rather than the assumed average physical and mental characteristics of the population. Their strategy was to label this real population as a consumer market and to promote accessibility as lucrative to architects and builders by using population statistics about the prevalence of disability, effectively rendering disabled people as niche consumers in late capitalism. And so we can see this direct line of continuity here between rehabilitation research, law, and education, as well as how the reduction of disabled bodies to measurements obscured, for example, their race and housing status, and it didn't in any way challenge the gender norms of the representation of the disabled user as a mother and homemaker. And these ways of knowing in turn shaped the disabled worker and productive spatial citizen as a consumer for whom getting access requires productivity and buying power. Well, at the University of Illinois, a rehabilitation program was shaping national accessibility standards. Here at Berkeley, an alternative paradigm was emerging that rejected rehabilitation knowledge in favor of establishing disabled people as experts about the built environment. This paradigm was part of a broader trend that I call epistemic activism, which is activism within the spheres of research and education to produce social change. Of course, the movement here also engaged in many forms of direct action. Shown on this slide is an image of a group of protesters. They appear white, many of them appear to be women here in Berkeley, and one person is holding up a sign that says, "Everybody needs equal access." This was a protest against the productivity imperative of the rehabilitation field. But a lot of the other activism was kind of in terms of things that were less legible and behind the scenes. In the late 60s, a group of disabled students attending the university for the first time lived together in the Cowell Infirmary, where they began to form a disability culture around shared hacking and tinkering activities. The group, later known as the Rolling Quads, organized a protest against their rehabilitation counselor and demanded to do things for themselves and for each other. For example, they helped each other design ways to lift in and out of bed, empty catheters, and open doorways without the help of non-disabled people. Eventually, they established a Center for Independent Living, borrowing the term from the rehab profession in order to get funding, and used it to advance their own political projects, which were based on a 1960s era self-help, do-it-yourself ethos similar to that of the Black Panther Party's community clinics and the feminist women's health clinics based here in Berkeley. Activists created a model in which disabled people themselves worked as care providers for and with each other, and also politicized their attendants who helped with building accessible designs. So this is what feminist disability studies scholar Alison Kafer refers to as a political relational model of disability, in which the focus is interdependence and mutual aid. The movement also claimed what they called a CRIP identity as a reclamation of the word cripple. This was an anti-assimilationist response to rehabilitation imperatives that disabled people must become productive citizens, and instead, activists claimed authority as design experts. What's interesting about the historical documentation of the Center for Independent Living is how similar it appeared to be to what today we would call a makerspace. In Berkeley, there were computer coding classes, so here in this image, In the foreground, there's this like long printed sheet of code because it's the late 70s. And then there are also a number of students in this coding class. And you see that there are a couple of people in wheelchairs and a teacher at the front. They also had a wheelchair repair shop modeled after DIY bicycle repair shops, activist mapping and accessibility auditing projects that collaborated with the College of Environmental Design. And they also had design projects like the curb cuts I showed earlier. These activities undergirded a phenomenon that I call crip technoscience, or acts of designing, hacking, and tinkering as forms of disability politics against norms and social structures. There are two images on this slide. The one on the left is a map of Berkeley's proposed curb cut route on Telegraph Avenue. This was drawn by Ruth Grimes, who is an urban planning student here at Berkeley and an ally of the movement. And this was kind of like a collaborative mapping exercise that was used to make the case for city funding of curb cuts. And on the right is an experimental map designed by Eric Dibner, who at the bottom of this kind of like lined paper sheet in pen, he signs his name Eric Dibner CIL for Center for Independent Living in place of an architect's signature. And the image shows a proposed ramp with notations of materials and slopes and things like that. So this is a kind of DIY architectural plan for a ramp. As I explained in the beginning of my talk, the design of curb cuts and ramps was also a site of crip technoscience. Not only did disabled people protest in accessible environments, but they also designed friction as a way of building cross-disability coalitions between wheelchair users and blind people using canes for mobility. And actually the design of ramps also came to serve as kind of a metaphor of political leverage for the movement. The movement philosophy also influenced Berkeley architecture professors Ray Lefshay and Barbara Winslow, who employed disabled activists as user experts. Here are 4 images of scenario planning exercises in their studio, which show architectural models. And then in the last image, a group of disabled people who are wheelchair users are gathered around the model to give feedback. Lefshay and Winslow worked with disability activists to write their book, Design for Independent Living, which translated the philosophical rejection of biomedical and rehabilitation models, as well as the typical architectural focus on form and aesthetics, and argued instead that disabled people are the real experts on built environments. The book has extensive images of disabled people engaging in Berkeley's counterculture, building social networks, engaging in intimate and sexual relationships, parenting, dancing, and other representations that challenge the rehabilitation imperative to merely become more productive through accessibility. Emblematic of the movement's crip technoscience ethos, Lefshay and Winslow offer the concept of non-conforming users, illustrating this with an image of a power chair user wheeling against traffic on a street without curb cuts. This concept offered to designers that users will sometimes refuse the constraints of an available design and behave differently, and maybe even engage with it in unpredictable ways that ought to be understood and appreciated. I just want to pause here for a moment to say that in my research lab, which is called the Critical Design Lab, we actually replicate a lot of the experiments from the early Center for Independent Living. And we do this in order to experiment with different ways of knowing and how they can shape design, but also to expand the boundaries of the university. We're a collective of disabled designers and makers, and some of our projects include accessibility mapping. There's a project called Mapping Access. Here I'm showing a screenshot of one of our maps, which is a kind of campus map. You see a lot of trees, they're colorful dots, and then there are these pop-ups with accessibility information. And then the other is Contra, which is a podcast on disability, design justice, and the life world. A new episode just aired this morning with Alice Wong, where we talk about crip technoscience and critical access. And here I'm just showing the logo of it, which is black text against a white background. I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. So the independent living movement is best known for the 1977 504 sit-in at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which was a 25-day occupation. The image here shows disabled protesters walking, rolling, and using white canes, taking a ramp into the building for the sit-in. By many accounts, cryptechnoscience enabled by disabled people's ingenuity and hacking skills also made the sit-in successful. Corbett O'Toole, who is here, in her book Fading Scars, tells the story of how disabled people rigged refrigerators from found materials and used ASL to communicate when the phone lines were cut off, and this enabled the longevity of the sit-in. This event is also remembered as being supported by the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. Sue Schweik has shown that the protest was in part organized by disabled Black Panther Bradley Lomax and his attendant Chuck Jackson. So the independent living movement through these protests and different activities was challenging the medicalization paradigm of rehabilitation, but norms of race and gender still persisted. As O'Toole has noted, the Bancroft collection on the movement actually doesn't include very many people of color, so the archives of the history of this event are extremely white. And in discussions of the 504 sit-in and in claims made by activists, we once again find a post-racial narrative about civil rights laws, that laws protecting Black citizens had passed and were successful, and that the time had come for disability protections as a new civil rights. This ignored the predominant whiteness of the milieu in which disability rights were materializing, as well as in the local community. And I'll just flag here, for anyone who's thinking about the history of the concept of intersectionality, that this was a year before the Combahee River Collective issued their statement that was one of the foundational texts of intersectionality. So that was in 1978. And then in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw wrote her article on intersectionality. So this is definitely before there's like a public discourse of intersectionality the way that there is in our culture today. Ultimately, the 504 protest was successful, and many of the leaders of the movement went on to work in the area of code compliance. Codes codified rehabilitation models of the body as a primary source of information about disability for architects. So in the 80s and 90s, there are tons of advertisements like the one I'm showing here. This is from a company called MetaNorm, and it makes ergonomic kitchens. And once again, there's like a white woman who's a wheelchair user in the kitchen. And race is very unmarked here as well. But there are some products that have a very different representation of race and gender. So this is the Huey Saturn, an architectural drafting table named for Black Panther Huey Newton. The image has a young white woman who's sitting in like a desk chair. So she's not in a kitchen, so that's good. So she's an architecture student. And then there's also an image of a Black man with an afro who is a wheelchair user. And they're using the same desk. And the text says, "No need to buy special drafting equipment for the handicapped. No budget waste, no time waste, no use waste." So it's simultaneously representing difference and economizing it and adopting this idea that disabled people are an economic burden. And it's saying, like, you know, this is not an economic burden. This looks like something resembling intersectionality, but it's actually not. It's kind of an emblematic example that Black feminists give of how gender is represented as white women, Blackness is represented as Black men, and of course, Black women, Black disabled women are not part of this picture. And it also doesn't address systematic inequalities or intersections. So we might wonder if the Huey Saturn actually changed the admission rates for Black disabled men and white women and Black women and Black disabled women in architecture schools. After the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990, there emerged a narrative similar to that post-racial narrative, that now there was a disability civil rights law, which meant that ableism was over, and the time had come to focus on disabled consumers instead of on civil rights. So that kind of liberal narrative was also working against disabled people. And the notion of a disability consumer market became increasingly non-explicit. That means disability is unmarked. And the focus became more on aging and luxury goods, similar to that house in Ohio I showed at the beginning. This is an advertisement from Leviton, a lighting manufacturer. And they advertise universal design in the same package with home security lighting. So the images show 3 generations of a nuclear family in this kind of well-lit living room. And then the exterior of 2 very large houses with lots of lighting. And so this really recalls the kind of racialization and securitization of the suburbs as this place that needs to somehow be protected with bright lighting. And again, these kind of tropes of the family. And there isn't any apparent disability or even discussion of disability in this whole advertisement. The only thing I could imagine would be a link is that there are grandparents in the image. So these representations also intersect with regimes of neoliberal austerity, because not only are disabled people required to be productive in order to become consumers and gain access, both in the law and in the market, but when the market becomes responsible for providing certain kinds of accessibility, it can also take it away. And that's something that's coming up right now in the straw ban debates, which many of us have been talking about. In architectural education, the language of design for all also continued. A project called Teaching Design for All later became the Universal Design Education Project. And in these projects, the leaders of accessibility education at architecture schools debated what issues fell under the umbrella of accessibility and design for all. And they really decided to maintain a focus on rehabilitation notions of usability, but they made explicit decisions not to include homelessness, incarceration, or race. And these are documented in like transcripts of conferences and stuff like that. They also adopted very safe issues around gender. For example, in the 90s, shopping malls were starting to have these family restrooms, and the Universal Design folks decided to appropriate that as an accessible space. And this later became the type of space that we would talk about in terms of like a trans-inclusive, all-gender restroom. But the language of it was very much based on the family unit. And in a lot of places it continues to be, and that family signage is often used to exclude trans people from those spaces. In the present day, ADA accessibility has also become a code compliance strategy, but not a design philosophy of anti-ableism. In my current book project called Enlivened City, I'm studying efforts to promote urban livability and sustainability in contemporary cities, looking at the textures of both human and non-human life and non-life that urban development invokes. So everything from tropes of blight, pathologization, and regeneration, to efforts to green and make more bike-friendly cities and things like that. My primary argument with this project is that efforts to promote population health through the built environment are also driving gentrification that has an effect, a negative effect on disabled people. Although in my ethnographic sites, most designs are ADA accessible, there are also a lot of anti-disability trends that circumvent accessibility. So the first image on the right is a kind of Normate Template image. It's the cover of the city paper for Nashville. The headline says, "Can Nashville design healthier citizens?" And behind it is this like Normate Vitruvian Man image. So kind of thinking about what types of populations are shaped through things like exercise, promotion, public structures, imperatives to take the stairs. And then in the image on the right, this is from an Open Streets Festival, which is when the streets are shut off for pedestrians and bicyclists. And it's a kind of quintessential image of a vital street life as one that's also consumer-oriented and involves things like human-powered transportation. In this project, I'm building on Gina Kim's concept of crip of color critique, which she argues doesn't simply focus on disability in terms of legible belonging within a civil rights category, but also investigates the systematic devaluation and subsequent disablement of non-normative minds and bodies. So I'm looking at resistances to livability from devalued body minds and paying attention to the users who are not considered disabled in the ADA, but whose disabilities are often produced by development and unevenly distributed economic growth. For example, construction workers who are hurt and killed in the condo boom, who have these sort of public funerals as direct action, unhoused people who protest development, and also landscapes that are harmed and extracted. And this project is also part of a collaborative thing that I'm doing with architect Jonna Keller and rhetorician Margaret Price called Sustaining Access, about the intersections of critical sustainability and disability studies. So I'm going to conclude now by discussing the contemporary disability justice movement led by disabled people of color and queer disabled people, and how its philosophies can shape critical approaches to access. The disability justice movement philosophy challenges disability rights frameworks that ignore intersectionality and focus on legal rather than material justice, and that mandate productive citizenship. And here I'm thinking of organizers and movement leaders such as Mia Mingus, Patricia Byrne, Leroy Moore, Alice Wong, Stacey Milburn, and others. Disability justice principles such as interdependence and collective access speak to the critiques and genealogies I've offered today. And in some ways, they replicate that kind of independent living movement ideology. Projects around collective access recall the mutual aid projects that I was talking about earlier, and new campaigns such as #AccessIsLove, which is shown here, and this is a sticker that says access is, solidarity is, disability justice is love, and the O in love is a heart. These reframe access as hospitality and kinship rather than consumerism, and this particular campaign raises money to benefit trans justice. This is another image. This is a drawing by Micah Bazant, who worked with Sins Invalid, a disability justice collective. And it shows, though the text says, disability justice means resisting together from solitary cells to open air prisons. To exist is to resist. And there's an image of a prisoner who's a wheelchair user reaching out to a person who is an amputee, who's a representation of a Palestinian person. So disability justice arguments and representations like these not only challenge the neoliberal precarity engendered by insurance frameworks, Medicaid work requirements, but they also call attention to how gentrification, housing insecurity, police brutality, colonial occupations, and mass incarceration are disability issues. And I want to argue that these can and also should be core design issues for accessibility and universal design. That designers who are already addressing these social justice issues, from refusing to build walls and spaces of solitary confinement to creating trans-inclusive bathrooms, should build solidarity with and adopt frameworks from disability justice rather than rehabilitation and legal standards as the philosophical basis of their work. Reorienting universal design toward disability justice lets us imagine futures in which designers and activists do not invoke post-racialism and other narrow conceptions of the user to define who counts as all. But these futures also require realigning universal design's relationship to disability. If the stories we tell about bodies and users matter for questions of justice, then it is with more accountable, historical knowing-making that we must begin. Thank you.